Welcome to episode 2 of Sabol Brothers on the Baseline Podcast, right here on the Press Play Podcast Network. Hi, everyone. I'm John Sabol.
And I'm Scott Sabol.
And we are really excited for this guest coming up here on our podcast, Scott, because this is somebody that you and I have been wanting to talk to for a while. We had Mark Price on episode 1,
right?
One of our childhood favorite Cleveland athletes of all time with the Cavaliers. We're going to go the baseball route here. And with the Indians, soon to be Cleveland Guardians, still in full swing here. Still fluttering around the 500 mark. We want to get some baseball talk in before we really get into Brown stuff.
And it's fun because our guest is Jeremy Feador. He is the Cleveland Indians baseball archivist. He's a part of the communications department. He's a gentleman who wears tons of hats, and and he'll talk about this. His job is constantly evolving. And what's interesting now that we're recording this in my basement here.
Yeah.
And, we have all the Indian stuff that we got from our grandfather, and we're seeing all this, old school stuff here. And so it kind of triggers all these questions that I want to ask Jeremy and get his perspective on what he has seen, what he's been exposed to, and what projects he's working on.
So Jeremy Feador, he's the Indians team historian, has been with the club for, I think, 2014. There's a lot that people don't really know real quick before we get into and introduce him, Scott. And the thing is this, people think of the Indians being in existence from the 1901 when they were the Naps and then changing the name to after the 14 to 15 season. But baseball in Cleveland has been played in the 1800s, dating back to 1860s. And Jeremy, we're going to talk to him about that and why that is so important, because we in Northeastern Ohio and across the country think Cleveland is a Browns town, and it is a Browns town, but baseball runs deep. By, at the time when the Browns came around, baseball was already being played for almost 80 years. So we're going to get into all of that, the name change, the cool pieces that Jeremy has on hand at Progressive Field that sits in the closet.
And he might have a story, too, about a cross-country driving trip that was a white knuckler. He'll have that for you, too.
That and more coming up right after this.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Powell, co-host of the Oranges, Oranger, Browns podcast. Check us out anywhere you listen to podcasts. For all your Browns coverage, post-game, pre-game, anything you need Browns, you'll find it here on the Oranges, Oranger, Browns podcast.
Hey, it's Tito, host of the Premier Fantasy Podcast. Get all the news and analysis you need to dominate your fantasy league. I've been doing this as long as anybody in the business. I can help give you the edge in your leagues. It's the Premier Fantasy Podcast, part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Welcome back to Sabol Brothers on the Baseline, part of the Press Play Podcast Network. I'm John Sabol.
And I'm Scott Sabol.
And we're joined by Cleveland Indians and soon to be Cleveland Guardians team historian. We'll get into the name change in a little bit. Jeremy Feador. Jeremy, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to talk baseball history.
Baseball history is something that Scott and I really have had a big interest in as far as I can remember. We wanted to go right into it and really talk about your background a little bit.
Yeah, so the basic question that someone like me who's a big Indians fan, Guardians fan, a baseball fan is, how did you get this dream job?
Yeah, I guess it all goes back to, growing up. I'm of that age when my formative years, the tribe was great and there were no Browns. So I've always loved baseball, and going through school, I went to my undergrad at BW and was a history major, and ended up doing this cemetery project where we researched and found where these people were buried in Berea. And I had a grant from the Ohio Humanities Council to do like a little museum exhibition. And after undergrad, my advisor said, "Oh, you like public history, so like museums and archives?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, yes I do." And ended up going to Wright State down in Dayton. I was a graduate assistant down there, and after that, I worked a few jobs. I was working as Baldwin Wallace's archivist for a little bit. I actually was doing some work with the Browns in their alumni department and a few other odd jobs. But then it got to a point where I was like, you know what? I like baseball more than football, and I love Cleveland, and I love, artifacts and history. So I figured, most teams have someone in a position like this. And I saw that the Indians didn't. So I ended up sending a letter to Bobby D with my my resume, and I said, well, the worst they're going to do is just throw it away and I'm out, 50 cents for a stamp. But Curtis and Bobby ended up calling me in, and it wasn't right away. It took like a year to kind of figure things out. I came in as an intern, and that year is when the Bob Feller Museum closed in Van Meter. So December of that year, Bobby D and I flew out to Van Meter with Bob's son Steve, and packed up the museum, and Bobby flipped me the keys to the U-Haul and said, "You're driving back from Van Meter, Iowa, and mind you, I've never driven a U-Haul further than Lakewood to Rocky River." So I was like, "Oh, okay," and driving over the Mississippi, and so the organization, they saw a value in what I did, and especially with the Feller museum in Van Meter closing, we had all this stuff, and there's just more teams are evolving into having someone on staff that has a background in museums and archives. So luckily for me, and luckily for me, I have a very supportive wife who I was on her healthcare for a while, her benefits and this and that. So I couldn't have done it without her. But that's kind of the long and the short of it.
A lot of persistence there. I always tell my son who's in high school, persistence, it's not going to come overnight.
Right. Yeah. And you just kind of got to make your own breaks and shoot your shots and, roll with it and see what happens.
So let's get right into this. You're driving the U-Haul back from Iowa. All right. So you got to be wondering, driving, I know that stretch because I went to school in St. Louis. You're driving on I-70 and you're, all you see is cornfields. Your mind can kind of play tricks with you when all you're seeing is cornfields and a house every mile. And now you have a U-Haul full of Bob Feller's memorabilia. You had to have been wondering, I got to keep this thing on the road. And secondly, when I get back here, how am I going to go through all this stuff? Got to go through your mind.
Yeah. And luckily for me, I think is that famous bat that used to be at the museum that we now have in the Terrace Club where Babe Ruth was leaning on, that was actually on loan to the Hall of Fame. So we didn't have that in the car, but we ended up leaving late afternoon and it was December. So it got dark quick. So I'm just driving and Bobby's, has phone calls and he's handling some stuff. So I'm like, all right, just, be careful when I merge or switch lanes. But we ended up stopping outside of South Bend for the night. So we had to park this U-Haul and we pulled it back. So there were trees, behind it. So you couldnn't get into the back and it was locked and all that stuff. But yeah, it was kind of a not white knuckler. I was lucky that it didn't, snow, or it could have been awful, but it actually turned out to be an okay drive. But then once we got it back, going through everything and a lot of things, we ended up taking, we have a bunch of autographed baseballs from Bob and photos. I mean, he signed a ton of stuff for the gift shop. And, obviously now Bob is no longer with us. We still have all these autographs, which is, something we use for odds and ends, but we were able to find, telegrams he got from people when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, one of which being a telegram from Jackie Robinson. And, so things like that are neat. And then, his Navy jacket from World War II. And I think things like that, fans, when they come into the ballpark, they see the statue of Bob Feller and he's this, bronze, larger than life character, but, he was a real person. And, I think the jacket and things like that really humanize him. And as much as statues are cool to see, I think the artifacts tell a much larger story and have that direct connection to a time that we can't access anymore.
Jeremy, what kind of U-Haul are we talking about? Are we talking about like a 14-footer? How big of a U-Haul?
I think it was one of the smaller ones. It wasn't huge, but and then after all that too, the New York Times had a story on everything, and they said Bob DiBiasio and another Indians employee. So I was like, man, like the New York Times kind of didn't put my name in there. So I was another Indians employee. Yeah, I was hoping for like a retraction from them, but never happened. So
right. When you look back at that moment when you were there when that museum closed and you were picking and packing and putting everything in the U-Haul, was there one piece of memorabilia that just stood out to you like, oh my gosh, this is really cool?
One thing, and I'm not sure if I noticed it there or if it wasn't until we got it back here, but we have, I think it was 1940 Bob's like All-American or triple, or I forget the award was. I think it's an All-American award, so they gave them to players of every position. And there's a bunch of signatures on the bottom. And I forget when I noticed it, but one of them is Babe Ruth's signature on this document. And it's in storage now just because I don't have space for it to put it out at this point. But seeing that, it's like, oh my goodness, this document is rather large too. I can't like a dimensions. I've seen a few at auction that are I don't know how much they go for, but nevertheless, it was a Bob's award, and it's got Babe, and I forget who else had signed it, but seeing that kind of connection, because I mean Babe Ruth autographs are always the talk of the town, I guess, or whenever you see them, it's always like, oh, neat. So I think that was probably because the famous bat was in Cooperstown, and then I say this thing was probably the most significant, interesting, and kind of like eye-opening.
Just from looking back at some of the Babe Ruth stuff can go for a lot of money. And you mentioned Bob Feller's autograph, for instance, and I heard this too. They say Bob Feller's, and Scott and I both have some, like a ball or something signed from him that we got over the years. I met Bob Feller at a book signing when I was in 8th grade, his little black book that he made, that he wrote in the early 2000s. It's a great fun read. But I heard, and I don't know who wrote it, and I don't know if this is true, but his signature probably isn't worth that much money, because it is estimated that he has signed the most signatures of any professional athlete of all time. Have you heard the same thing?
Yeah, people will get people, I have this Bob Feller signed, whatever. And it's like, yeah, I mean, you should see the amount of signed photos and balls we retrieve from, again, the museum gift shop. And, you go on eBay and you see Bob's stuff on there. So it's more of just the sentimental value, I think, probably outweighs the financial value. And even nowadays, just with the memorabilia market, I mean, everything is so saturated in terms of, I have a game used base. Well, we sell game used bases and this and that. And so versus I have, something from 1915 that is less common. That's why those are worth more. But Bob signed a lot. I mean, it's almost harder to find things that aren't signed by Bob. But in the other flip side of the coin, hey, he was making memories with people, and you get to hear these stories from fans like you guys. I met him here, I met him there, and I think that's one of the fascinating parts too of Bob's legacy, is all these stories people tell.
Yeah, so my brother and I, over the years, we've really had this fascination with old ballparks. Of course, the old ballpark for me growing up was Municipal Stadium. I saw my first Indians game there back in 1980, and our grandfather was an usher at Cleveland Stadium after World War II. But the Indians and the Cleveland baseball, we go back to League Park, and I remember reading somewhere when League Park shut down back in the 40s, the Indians moved a lot of stuff from League Park to Municipal Stadium. And I had heard that they moved a lot of scorebooks to Municipal Stadium, which eventually made it to Progressive Field in the early 90s. Do you guys still have some of those old scorebooks? And if they still exist, is there any plans on doing anything with those books?
I think I know what you're talking about. I think they're in this cabinet in the office. I hadn't actually gone through them per se, so I'm not sure how far back they go. But I have to check on those. I mean, you talk about moving all this stuff too. It's I guess going back to that, I mean, I haven't made any plans. I mean, my backlog of stuff like I want to do and stuff I'm able to do, and it's my eyes can get bigger than my stomach sometimes. Right. But now that you mentioned that, I can maybe go make a special dive into. But maybe I'll go check on that and see what is in those, because a lot of that information too now is just with Baseball Reference, and sure, it's all in there. So that information has made it over. But and there's just a story recently about a no-hitter from 1901 that the I don't know, the scorekeeper had something wrong. I have to go back and read it, but right, we might be the owners of the first no-hitter, and how record keeping and you think of the 1910 batting race and how those records were screwed up a little bit. So Cobb had 2 extra hits opposed to Lajoie. So maybe there is a value of going back into those and triple checking different numbers. But there's definitely a lot of projects and this and that I'd love to sink my teeth into. It's just a matter of the time, especially when season's going on too. I I help with some of our social media. So, if someone yells at Instagram, that's usually I'm the one that sees that.
So when the season winds down, so what kind of projects do you have that if you had a list, 3 projects that you really want to work on? Give us an example of things that you want to do personally with the stuff that you have.
So, one of the things I like doing, like you guys are doing right now too, are podcasts. I mean, I love to find like these stories to tell that are, off the beaten path, because, I love the 90s as much as any other Cleveland fan, but there's so much more to our history than just, that 1990s team. And granted, they're a great team. There's Hall of Famers on there. But I love finding these stories, and some of them are pretty consistent that pop up, like the Ray Caldwell lightning strike. And but I did a podcast about our home run king, and obviously it's Tommy, but who held that crown before Toby? And obviously you start with game 1, so the first guy to hit a home run is the home run king for however long that lasts, and trying to figure that out. And I have some stuff about Tito, and hopefully he eclipses Boudreaux soon, but the managers. So finding these stories that aren't just Albert Bell won 50 for 50, 50-50, and that's great, and these are part of our histories, but the stories that aren't told as much. And then you're doing a lot of internal organization and cataloging, digitization. We have program through work that I'm able to scan stuff and catalog it. And that way, 30 years ago there was no social media. Heck, 20 years ago there was no real Twitter and all that stuff. And now there's an outlet for this these images or these artifacts, and you can sync them up. If it's a Shane Bieber strikeout ball, to the actual strikeout, and put the video clip with it. So doing stuff like that, and even just doing more visual. There's so many different spots around Cleveland that I think fans would be interested in. One of my biggest interests is the Cleveland Forest Cities. It's the last 10 years I've been trying to write a book about them, and 2 kids later and lack of sleep, I'm getting there. I swear I'm getting there. But
yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Forest Cities, because I have a picture in my bar right behind in my basement here, right behind my brother, and it's the 1870s picture of the Forest Cities. These guys have those old, the old mustaches, and they it's you've seen the picture. I'm going to put it up here so you can see it, obviously, the fans, and I'll tweet out this on our Twitter page, but it's just that goofy looking, saloon looking, cartoon looking team.
Yeah, Jeremy, you and I a while ago were tweeting or DMing back and forth about this. I think this exact picture where you were trying to find a company that could make a long sleeve or 3/4 sleeve shirt with that logo on it, right? Remember that?
Yeah, I ended up finding one, and I play on the vintage team of the Forest Cities too, but we actually have the wrong colors. We were green and they would have been blue, but that team has, a Hall of Famer in Deacon White, who got in 2013. And he was one of the first, if not one of the very first players to wear a glove during a game. And, again, the emergence of that club in 1865. And they were paying guys in 1869, but we just weren't paying all of them like the Reds were. And then they played in the first professional versus professional game. So there's so many of these firsts, but since we're not a New York team, I think, or a Cincinnati, that history is still waiting to be, written. And I'm trying, and I'm swear I'm getting there. And it's just, some of these guys fought in the initial club had, Civil War guys and the connections to Sherwin-Williams founders, and just all these odds and ends that are fascinating. And but League Park is great, but that wasn't the first professional, ball field in Cleveland.
Right.
And, there's that one image of the Forest Cities and the Red Stockings together playing, I think it was in 1870 or 70. Yeah, it was 1870, right? It's I forget when the Reds folded, but they played out there. It was 1869. I don't know, but there's a fence behind them, and they're all kind of sitting there. And I
believe they played too by
Jaga Lake Field.
Yeah, there was. They played a couple of years, and it might not have been the Four Cities by Jaga Lake, but there was also a park, which I believe where now the current American Red Cross sits. It's right on East 55th, and I forget what it is. And I have the name of it might be Kennard Street Park.
Yeah, that was a later ballpark. And the Four Cities played, I think, where Tri-Cities campuses.
Yes.
Off of it was between East 39th and East 40th. And I have a map somewhere. It's just, getting back to that project.
Yeah.
It's when you love baseball so much and it's what you do for a living, in your spare time, sometimes it can be a little much. Like, all right, time to bear down for 2 more hours of intense baseball research. So,
and it's neat to see some of these parks where, you know, it wasn't a park like we would envision them today. It was basically a field. There might've been train tracks going through the outfield for all we know. I know there was one park like that. Might not have been here, but yeah, some of that stuff that's kind of lost, you know, a lot of the stuff prior to 1901, which, yeah, I know it was the old National League, and you know, when the Indians were the Blues and the Broncos, you know, a lot of that history, like you said, is lost. And love to see what you come up with if you ever have an opportunity to finish that one of many projects like that.
Yeah. Well, and fascinating about, you mentioned the Blues, and in 1901, there's not one reference of us ever being called Blues, whether it was the Plain Dealer or the press or visiting newspapers. And I've always found that fascinating. It's just there's just no mention of us ever as the Blues in 1901. We were kind of there were different random names thrown at us by, like, if you look at the Washington paper, I think they called us the Spiders, and we were called the Americans and the Babes. But I would just take one mention. If I could just find one that said, you guys were the Blues in 1901. Okay. But it's like all these weird little nuggets that, haven't, and I think part of it is you hear stories from, there's that Franklin Lewis book. And I mentioned that about the Indians after I think he wrote it in 1949, but there's stories that don't have, citations, and there's stuff like, how would he have known this? But you repeat it enough, and through the years, next thing you know, it's taken as a fact. And it's like, well, or you hear a story from Bob Feller, and that's always the worst. And we hear a player like tell a story, and it's like, oh, it's a great story. Then you go to Baseball Reference and you try to find the game, and it just doesn't exist. Or it's like it's a mashup of like 2 or 3 games. And
and you got to think age plays a role, where you just have so many memories that come kind of mesh together. Jeremy, I remember, I can't remember if it was a previous podcast that I listened to you on, or if it was maybe a segment on, I don't know, if the radio or television or whatever medium it was, but you mentioned how when the Indians, and Scott touched on it moments ago, when they moved, from the Municipal Stadium to Jacobs Field, now Progressive Field, there wasn't a lot of organization in the archives, in the team history, and a lot of those pieces of baseball here or there, a bat or whatever it is, got lost in the transition over, because there was a museum at the old Municipal Stadium, but when the Indians were bad and with the 70s and 80s, a lot of stuff got packed away. And correct me if I'm wrong, and a lot of it kind of, went off somewhere else, never be seen again, whether it was whoever might have taken it. How much, if you had to guess, you think is actually missing from what was there 40, 50 years ago?
And that's kind of my Indiana Jones hat, I guess. Like that's my favorite story is, so we were the very first team to have a team museum and team Hall of Fame back in 51 and 52. Shoeless Joe Jackson was invited, but he didn't make it down, ended up dying a few months later. But these players got these clocks, and those still exist with some families. But so we had this museum, and they said they had Wamby's triple play ball and Elmer Smith's bat from the 20 World Series, and a bat from Lajoie. And we have like 3 pictures I've seen. And again, I was trying to write an article for the Saber publication about this museum. And what happens is, like you said, the 50s turns into the 60s, and 60s turns into the 70s, and things just kind of, people aren't interested in this museum, and it gets boxed up. We have documentation that 2 things were sent to the Hall of Fame, but most of the stuff just was either packed up or lost. And there was this Ohio Baseball Hall of Fame, and I found pictures that they ended up somehow acquiring the mannequins / the uniforms that were on the mannequins too at their museum, because it's in a newspaper clipping I had found. So certain items went there, and then, stuff tends to, I don't know if it walked away or if it was given back. Like, we don't have an entire inventory of what was in the museum. And that's why, trying to find photos of it, and you have people that remember it, but they don't, maybe have the wherewithal to recall, this random object here or there. So we don't have really anything that was, I think, on display at that museum. And, it's kind of a, heartbreaking thing of like what was there and the few things that were mentioned. And like I said, you run into these issues too now where, certain things later on, the source of provenance, so to speak, in terms of, here's this ball, this is Wamby's triple play ball. Well, it's been missing for so long, or it's been, like, how do you tell a baseball from a baseball when it loses its chain of custody? And so you always get kind of leery of that stuff. There's this Ray Chapman quote unquote death ball in Florida. Well, the whole story is rather preposterous when you think about it, in terms of they say that, well, when Chapman was hit, the players came to pick him up off the home plate, and that Charlie Jameson was stepping on the ball, so he pocketed it, and then later on threw it into a bag and just gave it to this coach. And more or less, this ball has just way like Hollywood story trail, and now it's at a museum in Florida. Now it's probably a very old ball, sure, but is it the ball that hit Ray Chapman? I mean, no one knew Chapman was going to die right there. So,
You're not going to do a DNA test on the ball.
Right. It's just the story is just so trying to figure out, and I guess that kind of goes into a bigger picture of, we get calls from fans that have items that, we'd be happy to give homes to. And if people are cleaning out closets, we had someone send us pictures that their family took on a trip to Kansas City back in the 60s when we played out there, and, cool different angles that, candid shots that we've never seen before. And so you get things like that, and you get people we don't have a lot of our old programs. We've got people send those in, but if someone says, hey, I have a Bob Feller signed ball, it's like, well, that's great, which we have a lot of those, and try to be as diplomatic as you can just with that. But we're always hoping to find I have a gentleman that sent me pictures. He has a ball that is supposed to be the last out ball of the 20 World Series, and it might check out. The pictures seem to look right, and it's got some writing on it. So sometimes you have to take things with a context. And again, going to the Feller Museum, we have a ball signed by a bunch of guys from the late 1930s or mid 1930s team, and the story goes Bob got a ball and dollar when he signed with Cy back in the 30s. So it fits this period. And I ended up talking to Steve, his son. I said, hey, Steve, is this the ball that your dad got when he signed his first contract? He's like, well, I don't know, but it would make sense as to why he saved it. Now, it could also be something a fan sent. Mm-hmm. So we have it on display, and it's like, well, this ball is very much like the one he would have got, if not the ball. So you leave it with the fan to kind of think and take it into context.
It's like everybody who was around when Len Barker pitched the perfect game. A million people say they were there, but in reality, there was like 5,000 people there, and it was almost an afterthought. I've talked to sports people, sports writers that, hey, wait, it's the fifth inning. There's something going on down at Municipal. I think Len Barker, it's the fifth inning. There's a perfect game going on. That kind of thing. The story gets blown out of proportion over the decades. Right.
And yeah. I'm not sure. I know Rick, I think, has the last out ball from that. And, you wonder where half these things went. And like Rajay's home run, I have no idea where that ball went. I mean, hit the camera and fell into the field. And I've never seen or heard from where it went. The camera never cuts back to us. I don't think it's, and same with like Asdrubal. He had that unassisted triple play, bro. When he was running into the dugout, he flipped it into the crowd. And once it goes into the crowd, if I caught a ball and I had another ball in my back pocket, you could swap them out. So once things go. Exactly.
So Progressive Field opened in April of '94. Now where we've been talking about nostalgia and all these different items that you guys have acquired, is there any talk of maybe creating a museum at Progressive Field for all this stuff? I know space is a problem, but is there any talk of that where fans can go in and kind of look at some of this stuff and maybe rotate pieces in and out?
So, actually there was a museum when this place first opened. If you go in the team shop,
the team shop,
you see that archway. It was all in there. But as of now, I mean, there's nothing on the table, but we're always looking for ways to get our history out there. And we have, the 2 display cases in the corner bar, but that something like that, you balance preservation with, hey, we have this stuff. We can't just sit on it forever. It's not fun if people can't see it. So we can put stuff out there that's not going to, that'll withstand the open elements. But we're always looking for ways, and more teams, I think, are going forward with projects like that, just because, baseball and history, more than any other sport, just go hand in hand. And now, as we're saving stuff, we'll be coming up on anniversaries, and we have Tyler Naquin's walk-off jersey from this inside the park home run, and same with Jay Bruce from his the double for the 22nd win. So like we have these items, and you could build this great museum, but if you don't have items to populate it, well then that's the other side of the coin. So trying to find that happy medium. But I think obviously there's a lot going on right now, so I'm hoping my hope is, somewhere down the line, we start, doing more with it. And, you never know, but that's my hope. That's always what I'm shooting for, because again, it's one thing to have this stuff, but if no one can enjoy it, then it's kind of not pointless, but you know what I mean? Like,
you don't want it sitting in a box in a basement somewhere for all eternity.
Right. Like, and that's why myself, I'm not a private collector, because, if you're a Civil War collector, fine, cool. You have random muskets. There were so many of them produced, or rifles. But like, if you have, a letter written by Lincoln to Grant or something like that, and you're just keeping it in your basement, like, historians can't learn from it and people can't enjoy it. And for me, I just, I'm very much into the public history of getting it out to fans and letting people see it and learn from it.
1948 banner, you've always talked about it. It's your most asked question. For those who don't know, what Bill Veeck, the then Indians owner at the end of the 49 season, buried the Indians 1948 World Series championship banner that was hanging at Municipal Stadium, had a funeral about it, buried it in the outfield of the stadium. Now, here's the question. One, did they ever take it out of the grass after they did it? Where do you think it is now? And if it is still in the ground with the constant construction of now First Energy Stadium, it probably then decomposed, or did it get ripped out earlier? What do you think?
So what happened was, the next day, Veeck took it out because he had to return the casket they used. So they did dig it out.
Really?
And and then
that's funny.
There was an Ask Hal or something in the papers in the 60s where they brought out the flag, and there was we have some pictures of when Bill Veeck came back to Cleveland that you can see the pennant in the background. I can send you those pictures. Like, they're colored shots, so it's nice. You can see what it actually looked like. Now my guess is it probably sat somewhere where maybe it got wet or it got nasty. And, as we move from ballpark to ballpark, it wouldn't surprise me if it was still there that it got pitched, because I think if it still existed, the amount of attention it was getting during the 2016 season, someone would have said, oh, hey, I have this. But something so big like that, it's just, it's cumbersome. And it's very difficult to display in any sort of house. And like I said, I think if someone had it, they probably would have said, hey, here it is, mystery solved. But so my guess is it's, in a landfill somewhere. But, hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully someone does have it and they're just keeping a low profile till the time is right. But I have not had any leads since, those few stories I've come across. It's just amazing, the wealth of history we have here. And I'd be happy to talk more about it. If you guys want to have me on again, I could talk for days. I just, my other job duties, I'm helping with something else in the communications department in a little bit. So I got to boogie down to the field, but I'm always happy to talk more nuanced if you want, or you want to know about more artifacts or things we've saved recently. I'd be happy to chat about that.
Scott and I could talk for hours and days with you. And one of these days we got to come up to the ballpark and you got to show us the closet full of the treasure trove of items.
Yeah, definitely. I would be happy to pull some stuff out and then have you guys check it out and make a show out of that or something. I don't care. Sure. It's awesome history. And again, it's Cleveland's history. It's right. If you're a fan of the team, it's all of ours. And that's the best part I think about all this, because again, baseball connects everyone. And whether it's talking to your dad who watched, Sam McDowell pitch and, I'm watching Shane Bieber or, just, hey, remember where you were when Giambi hit that home run or this and that. And I think that's what's so fun about baseball, because you have so many games and so many memories. So that's my soapbox. And like I said, I'm happy to chat whenever you guys will have me.
Sure. Jeremy, I know what's going to happen. We're going to hang up with you. And then my brother and I will have about a dozen more questions, and we'll save them for the next time we have you on the podcast. So everybody, this is Jeremy Feador. He is the Indians baseball archivist. You're a part of the communications department with the Cleveland Indians. You can also follow him on Twitter at jfeador if you have any questions for him. Jeremy, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us. I know you're busy. Have a great rest of the season with the Indians, okay?
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. We appreciate it. We'll have you back on soon.
Awesome.
So that was Jeremy Feador. Boy, he has so much to talk about, and we could have done this podcast for a 2-hour podcast, because he said he's a talker and he's got tons of information, and we'll have him back on again soon, because I have a whole bunch of more questions I'll have here when we hang up with.
What I would love to do is to sit there and talk with him and go through items. That would be like Christmas morning.
Kind of like one of those old, those cable shows where the guy has
the Antique Roadshow.
Yeah. And he's going through all this stuff and he's like, oh, what's this? Oh, well, this is a knife from 1870 or or baseball from this. That would be neat to do.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is there are boxes and boxes, and I've seen pictures of this from what he tweeted some of the past, or maybe that were on the Indians website when they did a move in the building from room to room at one point in time. There was this picture, and I looked at these boxes, and I'm just like, man, Scott, I wonder what is in that box. Is that an old glove, an old bat, like a signed picture from somebody? It could be something silly as an old sign from League Park. I love the signage aspect of ballparks, and because they're so old, and the stories and what they have seen. Obviously, the when you think of baseball, you have a bat, a glove, and a ball, what are really cool too. But there's your non-traditional items too. He talked about what I found interesting: the drive back from Iowa, from Bob Feller's museum, and being really careful because he had a U-Haul full of really cool stuff.
Yeah.
But the one piece of that he saw in there, in terms of would come with nostalgic, could have been for could be worth a lot of money, was a document signed by Babe Ruth.
Right.
If I'm driving a U-Haul with something signed by Babe Ruth, I am going to be all the way in the right slow lane, going really, really slow, because there's no way I'm having a wreck with that in there.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine. I remember driving to U-Haul, driving to my first job, and that was and that's just with an old couch and an old dresser, and I was scared. I can only imagine what he was going through driving from Iowa all the way to Cleveland with that with the treasure trove of stuff from Bob Feller's museum.
The one thing too, that museum that closed down, there's a lot of cool things there. They're actually currently now, we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but that are at the League Park Museum.
Correct.
The Baseball Heritage Museum. And someone, and I don't know who, but anybody listening out there probably may know that story of someone built a 3D or a big model, maybe I think it's like 4 feet wide, of League Park that was at the Van Meter Stadium, that just recently in the last year, maybe before COVID hit, had been moved to the League Park Museum. Right. You and I were there in the summer of 2018. It was not there yet. I think it had come maybe at the end of 2019. It's a big piece. It looks really cool. It's basically a League Park model that used to be in Bob Feller's museum there in Van Meter, Iowa.
I can only imagine looking in Bob Feller, and I've talked to some people that have been in Bob Feller's basement, and when he was still with us, and just the cool stuff and going around. And he was very proud of baseball and his service to the country and his service to baseball and what he could bring to the community. So anyway, so it was neat to hear Jeremy's perspective, and we hope to have him on the show again, because I'm sure, again, we're going to have a whole bunch of new stuff coming to the forefront here in the off season.
Jeremy's a wealth of knowledge. Again, follow him at Feador on Twitter. That's Feador, because this guy will tweet random documents or pieces of Cleveland Indians memorabilia, and it's a really cool thing to do if you're into that kind of stuff, because a piece of paper is a piece of paper, but it tells a lot.
Do you think he has a stadium seat from League Park? Because we've been looking for him. We talk about stadium seats. I know I'm off topic here a little bit, but those go for some big money. I know there's a few floating around the country,
and that is actually a really funny, a good segue, because this is a good tease for another episode down the road. Right. We know a guy who had some.
Yes.
And for those that don't know, League Park seats in Cleveland are one of the most rare seats that you could find of any North American stadium in Canada or United States when it comes to that. And they're around there, but they are awfully hard to get to. And if you find some, they are worth a lot of money. And there's I think one or two in the League Park Museum now. But that's a podcast for a different
We'll
day.
talk about that later on.
That's a really cool story. But Jeremy's got a lot of cool things there. And like I said, we could talk to him forever. Right. And as we sit here in your basement with all your cool, Cleveland Indians, Cavs, and Browns pictures and some memorabilia, it just strikes up some, interesting questions for him. So that is Jeremy Feador of the Cleveland Indians, soon to be Guardians. By the way, Scott, real quick, before we wrap this up, thoughts on the name change?
It's a safe name change. I mean, there were a couple that I didn't like. I didn't like the Cleveland Rockers. I thought that was corny. My personal opinion.
I agree.
The Spiders, they ran into trademark issues, I think, with the Spiders and a few others. The Guardians, it works. Maybe not my necessarily my favorite, but it's something that I think over time, for me as an Indians fan, a Cleveland baseball fan, I'll get used to it. And I do like the fact that they vetted the process, and it took a while, and they wrapped it up quick. I'm not a big fan of the logo. However, I think logos change, and I think they'll do that. I wanted the Spiders. I thought the Spiders would have been cool, but I'm okay with the Guardians. And it'll be interesting to go to games starting next year and not seeing the Indians script, but we'll see it with Guardians. I want a Cleveland Forest City's wool jersey from 1869. He was talking about he wanted to get
the
one.
interlocking CF for the Forest
and
Cities.
One of those cool mustaches, but that's beside the point.
You could grow a good mustache.
A little handlebar. I'll do that when I retire.
I don't know if the bosses will let you do
probably
that,
not.
But it would look good. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, here on the episode number 2 here on the Sabol Brothers on the Baseline podcast, part of the Press Play Podcast Network. We've got a lot more coming up for you in the next coming weeks. And remember, you can subscribe on Apple and Spotify and getting updates on our new episodes coming up. We're going to start to maybe try to get into some Brown stuff coming up in the next few weeks. Thanks for listening, everyone. And again, this is Sabol Brothers on the Baseline podcast, all part of the Press Play Podcast Network.